Thank you so much. All right. Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here. I feel like the cardiac arrest sounded more morbid than I intended it to. My fun fact is, I got better, so I'm doing okay now. It's a happy story at the end of the day. But it was due to a rare disease, and I think, just to kind of go back to that for a second, I'm very passionate about what we do at Klick from a medical communication standpoint, because I have that personal experience. And so I can sort of bring a unique perspective to the table. And it's sort of what I like to do when I'm thinking of what do physicians need to know, and what would help them to better the rare disease, patient journey and the education that they need along that journey as well. So just to give a little bit more of an introduction. So I'm from Klick. Klick is a creative agency. So, we might be thought of as one of those more expensive agency partners to work with. But one thing I'll just highlight is Klick started about 27 or 28 years ago as a tech company. So we're very, digital natives, digital first when it comes to the work that we do. If you'll be at Fierce Pharma next week, I'm actually presenting there on how we use AI in all of our workflows to, really elevate the products that we're delivering for our clients. And I'll talk about some of the things that came up in the last presentation and just sort of our viewpoint on how we handle those in peer-to-peer marketing. But to jump in, I'm going to talk about peer-to-peer marketing today, but I want to set us up with what does the world look like today? And I think it's really three things. Today's world is high science, we're high speed, and we're high tech. And I think that is very apparent when we look at the regulatory landscape. And so this data is all from 2024, so just last year. And in 2024, we saw that 2/3 of new approvals were on an accelerated pathway, or at least one expedited pathway. And so I think that's pretty much, that high speed sort of, aspect of the world that we live in today. We also know that rare isn't so rare anymore. As a rare disease patient, I always say I personally have a rare disease, but if you look at how many people have rare diseases, everyone in this room knows someone, not just me, you know someone else in your life that probably does have a rare disease. Last year, just over half of FDA approvals were for orphan drugs. So we're really starting to address that rare disease space. And new is really the new normal when it comes to that. We're thinking of, in same year, 2024, just under half were FDA approvals were for first-in-class MOAs. I think you combine that stat, and you really see that is sort of a high science thing, right? We're exploring new avenues in the world, and there's a lot we need to educate folks on if we're going to do that. And not only is the world high science, high tech, and high speed, but today's HCPs are as well. Science has really become social. We see that HCPs, 65% in a recent survey, reported that they're using social media for professional purposes. So that's become sort of the new venue of scientific exchange. And I think we have to keep that in mind when we think of the types of experiences and education that we're delivering to those folks. We also know that they're also using AI. It's not just the people in this room who are thinking of how do we use or AI in our own jobs, but physicians are actually using AI in their work as well, with 66% of them reporting that they're using AI in 2024. And then I think finally, going back to that kind of notion of high speed, time is a really scarce resource for these folks. And that's not really new news. But I just sort of wanted to include that here as well, because I think it's getting more and more scarce every day, right? There's just so much new information out there that we need to process. And for 60% of physicians, they're spending less than 30 minutes a day keeping up with medical news and education, which really points to how we need to change our approach to education to fit into their sort of needs that they have today. And just to talk a little bit more about that high-speed aspect of the world, we're living in this post-pandemic world, and it's really set a new bar for medical education at speed. So I'm not going to go through this timeline. I think we all lived through it, and we might not want to re-traumatize ourselves with the thoughts of how we lived through it. But I think what COVID really did is showed how quickly we can have new science really be translated into something clinically useful and come to market so fast. This is just looking at the timeline of that vaccine development from the start of the pandemic in late 2019 to spring 2021. About a year and a half later, that we're seeing these large distribution of vaccines, of these mRNA vaccines, a new technology that we really had to educate folks on. So we didn't have to just bring it to market at speed, but we have to get people comfortable with it as well. And I think, just to tie that all together as well, just even looking more long-term than the pandemic, we're really changing how we share and consume our information. That's really evolved over time. This is just looking since, the very late 80s here, but looking at, we started with the World Wide Web, and that really increased accessibility. Folks were able to go find information themselves that they weren't able to get before. And that evolved over time as well into an era of snackability, where there's short-form content that folks want to engage with and to consume. And I think, Stephanie's presentation earlier about binge-worthy content, Netflix is on here, as established in 2007. I spend a lot of weekends binging probably too much content there, but it is sort of a way of life now for how we think about the world. And I think also it evolved into shareability. All of the different social media platforms we have became this space to share everything about our lives, and that includes that scientific exchange and medical education. And I'm curious what AI is going to do with all of this. Obviously, AI is already sort of part of all of these aspects of how we consume information now, but I think it's also leading into this era of ownability that we're experiencing now, where people want to be involved in defining the content they consume and involved in determining what content they want to consume. They don't want it to be pushed towards them. They want to be involved collaboratively in that process. And so, what does kind of all of that mean for peer-to-peer marketing? So this is the stuff that I'm sort of always thinking about when I'm thinking of how do we at Klick evolve our capabilities to better serve you guys, to do it more efficiently, and to also just elevate the impact that we're making at the end of the day. And so, I'm going to talk about peer-to-peer, and I think I want to start with saying that traditional speaker programs still offer value. I'm not saying throw those out the window at this point, because I think it really offers that opportunity to learn about new clinical data, the resources and tools your companies might be coming up with that are sort of, in tandem with that new data, and helping to educate on how we think of different diseases and the pathophysiology behind them. They're also a physical space for that scientific exchange. We're really getting folks together and allowing HCPs who work in the community to connect with the experts in those fields who can help them to elevate their own practice. And I think it's no secret as well that it's a way for everyone in this room to learn more about their key customers and to uncover insights that can inform your future marketing efforts as well. So there's still a lot of value in this traditional model. But based on everything I was saying before, HCPs really are demanding new ways of learning. And so these are just a few key stats that kind of stuck out to me as I'm thinking about the way forward and how we really elevate our marketing efforts in this space. And so I'll just share a few of them. So over 80% of HCPs are saying that they want convenient on-demand content. They want it on their own time, their own way. But we're still, a lot of pharma marketers are still largely valuing in-person interactions over that on-demand content consumption. So there's a shift there that needs to happen to sort of align to those HCP preferences. And also, over 90% of HCPs are saying they want that bite-sized interactive content. So we've all heard that term modular content, and I think it's a huge buzzword, and it has been for a few years now. But when we look at the data, only about just over half of pharma marketers are using modular content in practice. And there's a lot of barriers to that, and I understand that. So I think that's another shift we sort of have to make across the board. And then finally, over 85% of HCPs want better access to e-learning. So not necessarily CME, but to the learning materials that you guys are all providing in this room. But again, just under half of pharma marketers see this as a lower priority in their sort of mix of things that they're doing from a med ed perspective. And so if we want to deliver value, but also build trust with our HCPs and have them see us as a great resource and not something to kind of look at with some skepticism, we're going to need to rise up to meet those demands of what they want in terms of their medical education. And so I'm going to go through sort of just my thoughts on what I think the future looks like. Some of these things are not far off in the future. They're things we're doing today, but just sort of how I see us changing the peer-to-peer marketing landscape and the new standards that are going to come with that. And I think they sort of fall into 4 buckets, but a lot kind of overlap here. But I'll talk about the content itself. Are we presenting content that really matters to these folks, that they really want and need? I think participatory exchange is a big one. Are we just sort of being didactic in how we present, or are we involving our audience along the way and getting them engaged? That also ties into these immersive experiences. I feel like there's less of a desire to just sort of have static things presented to you, or just sort of that the lecture that I'm doing right now sort of thing, but how do we get folks actually feeling like they're immersed in an actual experience and taking something away from that? And then, hyper-personalization was brought up in a couple presentations, and that's something I think that applies here as well. We need those personalized learning journeys. And so I'll go through a few examples that fit into those different categories and just sort of share my thoughts. And I think the first one here is that we do need narratives and not data dumps. And one quote that sort of is always in my head when it comes to this is, people don't really remember numbers. If I throw a bunch of statistics at you, like the ones I just did a little earlier in this presentation, you're probably not going to just recall them verbatim to me. But if I tell you a story, that's something that sticks in our heads. We love stories. We love to binge content because we love stories. And so I think that applies to our science that we're communicating as well. HCPs are really screen fatigued. They're time poor. We have to educate them with empathy, and I think that's where narratives really come in. And one example that I really love, and this is just one of many, is when we tell the story of our mechanism of action. Sometimes that's really convoluted. It's really complex, really difficult to grasp, even for our physicians, because they're not necessarily the sort of like preclinical basic sciences folks who really grasp this information. And so how can we flip that on its head? One thing we've been doing is what we call a mechanism of meaning. So can we communicate really quickly what this mechanism of action does, and can we make it stick in your head? Can we make it a contagious idea? And so, here is just an example where we're talking about PD-1 and PD-L1 inhibitors and sort of the mechanism of action there. But when it comes down to it, in one simple sentence, we're saying checkpoint inhibitors take the brakes off the immune system. And that's how we're sort of describing this process. And it's like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Even for patients or caregivers or advocacy groups and payers, it's sort of something that hits across all of the different audiences you might have. I think another piece of this new standard is going to be channel agnostic content. And this was brought up too, right? We don't want to just always give the same story, the same content delivered in the same way to everyone. But also maybe we don't want to invest the time and resources and money that it's going to cost to make a completely new presentation every single time, or a completely new way of presenting content across different mediums. And so one thing that we've started thinking about at Klick is, how do we look at modular content in a channel agnostic way? And we've been using what we call our scientific content unit method, or our SCU method, to really do that. So instead of developing this core slide library where everything is kind of in PowerPoint, as we all are familiar with, how can we actually make something that's truly omni-channel ready? And I realize that's a buzzword as well. Apologies for the buzzwords. But how do we make something that we can drag and drop into different venues, and we can reorganize content to tell a new story that's going to resonate with someone else? And I think the other thing we're going to need is a modern participatory approach. I think in the past, and this is definitely something that's changing right now, depending on which clients I'm talking to, the sort of ethos of how we do medical education differs across those different folks. But I think what we have to do is really move away from this paternalistic, pharma-led approach that we've had in the past towards something that's more participatory and really focused on the HCP experience. And I'm going to come back to experience a lot here, because I think that's also something we remember. We remember stories, and we remember our experiences, whether they're good or bad. Hopefully we're making good ones here. But talking about sort of that traditional approach, it really was paternalistic in a lot of ways. We're getting information out there, and it's sort of just pharma-led in that way. And we get the information out there, and then we use it to create something that's really centered on an event. Maybe it's a Congress symposium, maybe it is a peer-to-peer speaker program, a dinner program. But I think while those things still have value, obviously, today, we talked about what physicians really want and how they're living their lives. They're just like all of us, right? They're consuming content that is quick hit, that's really bingeable, that is something that is snackable and self-service. They can do it at any time on their own time. And I think we have to live up to that demand from these HCPs as well. So we have to think about, they want to self-curate that content. Where do we put it so that they can do that? And we're also still driving it to them and putting it in front of them and letting them say, like, oh, wow, I really do want to engage with that content. And this is where I'm going to also talk about what that content needs to look like, because I think that's somewhere where we sometimes fall short as well. And I know that's been brought up a couple times here, even just this morning at the beginning of the conference. Where do we fall short in terms of actually making presentations and content that matters to our audience? And I think of it in a few different ways. And I think captivating your audience is important. You want to come on stage and sort of already have them involved and engaged in what you're going to be presenting. And that works in the digital space too. As soon as you get that content in front of someone, you want them to feel captivated so that they continue on that learning journey. And you want to motivate them, and you want to create interactivity so that they continue along that learning journey as well. And they're really invested in making sure that they're taking something away from what you're presenting. So I think the first step there, and this is all stuff that we've learned through a huge body of research on adult learning and just how do people really learn. And of course, our HCPs are adults, barring maybe a couple geniuses, Doogie Howser types. But I think the first thing we want to do, and what we know from the research, is that we need to gain their attention. And I think there's a few different ways you can do that. Obviously, we've all done icebreakers, and we're all, we have different opinions on how those work. But I think, some of the elements I think of are the creative design, the interactivity. Are you building things in that's dynamic and not just static on a page, and you're really, even just visually, drawing people's focus to what's going on screen? And I think also engaging presenters. One thing we've been doing now is, we know that a lot of our physicians, our KOLs, they're not always trained in how to speak to an audience. They know their data. They can go on stage and they can present it accurately, but are they really captivating their audience? And one thing we've been doing is working with folks who are experts in training folks on how to be engaging presenters. And we'll get the doctors in front of them as well, and we'll say, let's work on this and make this another skill in your arsenal. It's definitely something all of us can learn. I think reducing cognitive load as part of your content is also really important. We talked about how all of us really, not just HCPs, we're very fatigued with the information overload that we have in our current society. Every day there's thousands of new papers that are coming out. No one can keep up with all of that realistically. Even just within one singular field, you wouldn't be able to keep up with 50 new papers a day. And so we know that they're information fatigued, they're decision fatigued, and so how do we reduce their cognitive load and help them to process things faster without just putting data dumps on a slide, and helping them to stay engaged and retain that information more effectively through things like narratives and through interactivity. And interactivity also plays into the motivation and how people retain information. Again, we really we retain information through stories and through hands-on immersive experiences. And I think some more buzzwords here, but gamification really does matter. And I think the cool thing about being at Klick is I've actually worked with people who are gaming strategists, and we collaborate on how do we build this science into something that is truly hands-on, that we can actually, whether it is a true video game or some sort of experience that involves those gamification principles, how do we get folks involved and sustain that attention and increase motivation to learn? And all of those things can help to reinforce learning and improve their overall retention so they walk out of whatever program experience, digital experience that you're having, and they actually come out with something that they're going to be able to apply in real life. And I think what we all need to keep in mind at the end of the day is we're doing all of this to improve patient outcomes. And I think if that's our guiding light, and as both a patient and a medcoms professional, it's something I'm thinking about all the time. Everything we do is so meaningful, and so we need to bring HCP is something that is going to stick because that is what ultimately is going to improve patient outcomes. And speaking of the idea of experiences, I think one thing we know is HCPs, again, adult learners, and we know that adult learners don't want to passively take in information. They don't want to sit in a lecture hall and, like we're doing right now, and sort of just take in that information. They want to be actively involved in that learning process. And I think this is something we all know. We've been talking about principles of adult learning for a long time now in the marketing space. But how do we really, actually operationalize that? I think we have to involve HCPs early, and not just your KOLs. I think we've followed a KOL model for a long time, and they're still very valuable players in this space. But what about our community HCPs or our APPs and other folks who are really going to know the patients and the landscape and what they need to clinically implement a new product? I think that's really important to keep in mind. And when we engage those folks early, it's not just about, here's our content plan and sort of what we want to do, but let's work with them to build something from the ground up. Have them really sort of, help you co-create whatever experience and content that you're going to be putting out there. And I think we need to invite them to share their real-world experience. And that's something that we often do, right? We solicit for patient cases, for example. But how often do we have to really water those down into something that becomes more of a patient portrayal versus a real patient experience? And so, we need to make sure that we're actually using all of this valuable information they're providing. And I think, too, I've talked a lot about interactivity, But we don't want to overload either, right? We don't want to do interactivity for interactivity's sake. We want to have a purpose for that, and we want to use it effectively. The hyper-personalization factor, that was brought up earlier too, and so I was thinking about that and knowing I was going to sort of present on this slide about hyper-personalized learning journeys. And just to throw a couple more stats at you that you won't necessarily be able to recall later, because you'll recall the story and sort of what you were thinking right now. But 40% of physicians say that they're less likely to engage with information that's generic and not personalized to their needs. And I think that's probably true of all of us. I think when we feel like it's not authentic and not sort of personalized to who we are, it's less likely to be something that captivates and motivates us. We also know that about 80% of physicians feel that pharmaceutical companies are providing a one-size-fits-all experience. And I think that's true too, and that's been some of the limits that we've seen just based on time, money, resources, and the people power of creating content that really isn't one-size-fits-all. But to tie it to the aspect of AI, obviously, we all have been thinking of how does AI sort of transform the future, and I think here it's really helpful for generating insights and customizing that learning experience. I think we can really drill down now to that individual level. We saw that in the last presentation, and because of that, we can deliver the right information at the right time to the right individual, and I think that makes a huge difference. I think the other thing is we can't think of any one tactic in a silo. And we all know that. I think that's all something we know. But we also know that because of time, money, resources, people power, a lot of times we end up in silos, whether it's on purpose or sort of just by accident. We sort of end up in our own little silos here. I've worked with many teams who sort of have peer-to-peer marketing over here, separate from HCP AOR marketing, and the two don't really communicate that well sometimes. And so I think we need to overcome those barriers and make sure from the start we're really setting up this connection and this connectivity and collaboration so that we can create this unified HCP learning journey. And I was just talking about how AI can help us to do that. And I think that works here as well. As you're connecting all those different learning experiences and that overall learning journey for an individual, you're gaining information about them along the way. And so not only are we powering this learning journey by the insights we already have, but we're continuing to learn and to continue to power everything by the HCP insights we're gaining through those interactions. And so I think thinking of it from sort of both ends there is really important. So those are sort of my broad examples of what I'm thinking in terms of the future of promo med ed and peer-to-peer marketing. And so you might be saying, I see what you're saying here, but how do we get there? There's a lot of barriers to what we're talking about. And when I talk to my teams about this, I honestly bring it back to design thinking. This is something that in my academic work was really important to me and something that I've carried through into my professional life as well. But design thinking is this really human-focused way of problem solving. And it's not even really problem solving, it's actually building solutions, because we try and flip it on its head. Every time we think of problems, we're putting ourselves in sort of this negative space. And obviously we need to overcome those problems. But what if we flipped it on its head and we thought in terms of solutions? What is the solution I'm trying to create here? That can actually open up our minds into a different mindset and frame shift, and we can start thinking a little more innovatively about what we want to do here. And designing for impact can really help us to think about all of those things in terms of captivating, motivating, interactivity, really helping folks to retain information. And it's also a very fast process. We talked about this as a high-speed, high-science, high-tech world. And I think design thinking really aligns to that. As you're innovating, you're going to be thinking about, how do I make this better in the future? And the design thinking ethos is, do this rapid prototyping. Come up with something, define your ideas, ideate, make a prototype, get it out there and test it. And if it doesn't work, let's go back to the drawing board and see why it didn't work. And if we have an immediate solution to make it better, we can do that and implement. Or we can start empathizing again with our human-centered audience here. And I'll just offer this quote because I think sometimes folks are like, I know what design thinking is. It's really like sort of the Silicon Valley tech guy kind of thing. And it's really not. I know it was born out of more of like the sort of digital computer science sort of world, but it really plays a big role in how we think of education. And this is often, this quote here that I'll let you guys read on your own, it's really something that I think is more often applied to academic settings when we think of maybe formal medical schools or residency programs. But I think it applies to med ed provided by pharma as well. It's something that can help us to really shape an effective learning journey for our HCPs. I think measurement is also a huge thing here. How do we really drive impact? I think we gather a lot of insights, right? There's a ton of data out there, and often we just don't really know what to do with it. But luckily, we do have AI now to help us with generating those insights, taking a lot of information and helping us to synthesize it, and being the human in the loop to help our AI platforms do that. And so, I put up a few questions here where we start with maybe that traditional speaker program. We're thinking of, is our content relevant? Are HCPs really learning? Are we able to track that both in the short term right after a program and over time longitudinally? And, at the individual HCP level, what does your audience sort of need next? What's coming out of this program? Where are we going to have that next touch point? And that leads to that broader learning journey where there is, I showed that slide earlier with sort of all the different omni-channel touch points you might be having with an individual. And so we can go down that next part of the learning journey and continue to ask questions that are iterative and really help us to understand those insights and drive impact. And I think the biggest thing is there are compliance barriers to innovation, right? There always will be. I think that's sort of the role of our medical, legal, regulatory review partners. They need to sort of play that role to keep us in check as well. And so, while we're trying to innovate, obviously compliance is a key part of the recipe of innovation. And I think one thing I've learned is that we can start to innovate more effectively when we build collaborative partnerships with our MLR teams. And on the agency side, that can be a little more difficult for us to do. I feel like, the chances I get are when I'm really integrated into a team where I can meet those MLR reviewers on my own and start to, build that rapport in my own relationship. But I think we need to establish a ways of working and a culture that fosters innovation and also brings them into the fold. We think of our brand strategy, and we often aren't including them in that level of discussion. Maybe if they understand the context and the goals of your brand, they're able to say, yeah, let's work together on a compromise and a solution here. Of course, we've always done, concept reviews for innovative things, and I think obviously that's something we need to do here, but it's not just a box we want to check off. It's an opportunity to, again, reiterate that strategy, what solution you're providing and what problem you're solving, and really, bring them into the fold on all aspects and not just the content that you want to present. And then finally, formal and informal reviews both play a huge role here. I think offline discussions can foster trust and collaboration as well, and you can kind of co-create solutions with your MLR team. And so, sort of just what's next, I think, now is the time to really seize the opportunity to lead. And this is sort of just a summary of some of the things I'm thinking of when I think of that leadership. And I've got a few seconds left here, so I don't want to go over. Simon will yell at me. But, just kind of summing up what leadership is really demanding. And it's more than keeping up. It demands bold action. And some of the things you can take away from this presentation in terms of bold action are listed here. And so with that, I have 7 seconds left, maybe. Oh no, I'm counting up now. So I'll say thank you to all of you here. If you do want to download this presentation, I know I went through some things kind of quickly. Feel free to scan the QR code, and I'll be here today and tomorrow if you want to chat about what the future looks like. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Quentin. Real quick.